Okay, and we are live. So it looks like folks are just coming in. So I'll give a couple of minutes for people to just filter in. In the meantime, maybe I'll just set the stage. Oh, Kirsten, perfect. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi, Kirsten.
We literally just went live, so it's a perfect time for you to join.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
Likewise. So we have one more speaker that might potentially join, but in the meantime, we'll just get started. So thank you, everybody who is on the line. We cannot see you, but you can enter and talk to us via the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions that come up as people give presentations or as we do the panel, please do interact with us. This is meant to be a conversation with everybody who's on the line, not just a presentation from us to the rest of the community. So please take the opportunity to interact with us. Thank you and welcome to the webinar that's focused on practical barriers of eVTOL technologies that are going to be facing our industry in the next few years. As we all know, it's a very exciting time for the aviation community. The past 10 years, we've seen incredible promise and progress of all-electric and hybrid electric powered vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. We've seen applications from the Uber Elevate ecosystem, the urban air mobility platforms, and the US Air Force Agility Prime initiative. All of these have shown so much excitement that dictate that large corporations, governments, everyday public has for this new technology. And that's totally warranted because this new technology can fundamentally change the way that cities and our lifestyles are designed. That said, I think we all know that aviation history has a graveyard that's full of beautiful ideas of flight. So most notably, I think we all remember the excitement that the community had around very light jets and the fallout that endured over the overhype of the technology just a decade ago. So the focus of this webinar is what we can do to promote progress in aviation without creating a similar hype bubble. Or better said, how can we support the emerging players of our community to succeed for the benefit of all? So today you will hear perspectives from very well-known individuals in our community. Each of our speakers has very varied backgrounds and a wide swath of opinions about how best to promote this new technology. We'll begin with a brief presentation by Yolanka Wulff, and then we'll have a panel with open Q&A for the rest of the speakers. So please don't hesitate to pose questions, again, like I was saying, via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to try to get through them all. I will do my best to highlight those that are repeated first, and then get through the rest later. And now, Yolanka, if we can welcome you. Yolanka is the co-director of the Community Air Mobility Initiative. It's an advocacy group and a community and public education group in support of urban air mobility. Aside from your efforts with CAMI, Yolanka, you lead the Commercial Intra-City Working Group for the NASA Transformative Vertical Flight Initiative. And previously, Yolanka was a sustainable aviation consultant and a director of communications and public affairs at Ampere. And for those of you who don't know yet who Ampere is, it's the electric aircraft manufacturer that's in Southern California. So with that, Yolanka, I'm going to give the floor to you, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about CAMI and what you guys are all about.
Sure. Thank you, Katerina. And it's a pleasure to be here. It's exciting to get to tell you all a little bit about CAMI and community acceptance, and also to have a conversation with my colleagues on the panel. I'm going to start by giving a presentation, so I will, if you'll give me just a moment, I will share my screen. And Katerina, I'll just confirm that, that you're now seeing my screen.
That's confirmed. It looks great.
Wonderful. So I was asked to talk today about the importance of community acceptance for the success of eVTOL technology. And so I'm going to go through a presentation that talks about urban air mobility and in particular, the challenge of public acceptance. And at the end, I'll tell you a little bit more about CAMI. Whoops, too fast. So we are in the third revolution of flight. The first revolution was powered flight, ushered in by the Wright brothers. And the second was the development of the jet engine. And now technology drivers such as the electrification of propulsion, autonomy, and mobility as a service are once again redefining flight. This allows us to lower costs and barriers to the use of small aircraft on shorter routes and increases the latent demand for flight as a viable alternative to ground transportation. And I just want to give a shout out to Radius Capital for providing this slide. So aircraft technology has been moving forward over the past 10 years. We still have a way to go with battery technology, but it's steadily improving. And we currently have sufficient capabilities for short route or hybrid propulsion systems. Over the past 5 years, industry has worked hand in hand with FAA, EASA, and other CAAs to develop standards and a pathway to certification for these aircraft. Additionally, there's R&D and standards work happening to support the necessary infrastructure and air traffic management for UAM systems. But public acceptance is regularly cited as the biggest hurdle to UAM implementation. As part of its national campaign, NASA has developed a framework for thinking about urban air mobility, or AAM, advanced air mobility, which includes 5 pillars that you see here: vehicle development and production, individual vehicle management and operations, airspace system design and implementation, airspace and fleet operations management, and community integration. And additionally, NASA has identified 7 cross-cutting issues: safety, security, affordability, noise, autonomy, UAM ports, and regulations certification. So to place CAMI, CAMI's work focuses on Pillar 5, that community integration, as well as the cross-cutting issues that affect this pillar. So we are addressing the issue of public acceptance. The term urban air mobility, or UAM, is used by different people to mean different things. So to kind of baseline us, at CAMI, we've adopted a broad definition, similar to NASA's Advanced Air Mobility, or AAM, terminology. So we're looking not just at operations within city centers, but also connecting those urban economic centers to the suburbs and the surrounding edge cities and rural areas. We're also not just looking at on-demand air taxi operations. UAM for us includes scheduled service, bus route style service, hub airport shuttles, and perhaps most importantly for early adoption, emergency services and cargo operations. So this is a view of aviation most people are familiar with today. There's a strict boundary between your daily life and your flight. And while we have to maintain security and safety in UAM operations, to be successful, we have to at least figuratively tear down that fence. Urban air mobility needs to be intimately integrated with existing transportation systems, including highways and transit options. And we need to do that integration in a way that doesn't create a whole host of new problems. Doing that integration correctly is really a local question. To date, most of the industry level regulatory and policy discussions have been happening at the federal level. We need to be working towards a constructive and consistent local regulatory landscape as well. And that means including all of the stakeholders. So who are those stakeholders? Well, you'll see many of them here. As you can see, they range from industry members such as manufacturers and operators in airports, to regulators at the federal, state, and local levels, agencies such as transportation and commerce, business owners, real estate developers, insurance companies, essential services, utilities, and of course, the public. As we've seen with drones, helicopters, airports, and 5G wireless, the general public isn't always in favor of new technology. We must provide the necessary information that communities need to make an informed decision about this new form of transportation and ensure that UAM is actually providing tangible value to as many people as possible within a community. To address these facets of public acceptance requires full and transparent engagement between the UAM industry, regulators, and community members. There are 4 critical factors that must be addressed to achieve public acceptance of urban air mobility as a transportation option: safety, public benefits, limited adverse impacts, and integration. We'll start with safety. Safety is critical and it's non-negotiable. Commercial aviation has a strong safety record. However, urban air mobility will scale to a level more akin to automobiles. It isn't a simple question to determine what is safe enough. While it's primarily up to regulators like the FAA to answer that question, we also have to consider the public perception of safety, which comes from trust and includes the feel of the aircraft, the feel of the trip, and how coverage of and response to the first accidents are handled. Instilling the belief that urban air mobility is safe in the mind of the public is key to public acceptance. It's also essential to public acceptance that we are able to demonstrate public benefits early on. One of the first questions that we often get is whether urban air vehicles are just limos for the very rich. The answer has to be no. Urban air mobility uses the 3rd dimension to provide commercial, economically viable transportation for the public. These benefits include increased transportation options, socioeconomic benefits, workforce development, and of course, emergency services. Urban air mobility has the potential to bring broad availability at a reasonable price to the public and a new mode of travel to metropolitan transportation systems. All of these benefits are in effect mitigating factors against the inevitable negative impacts that UAM will bring. To achieve public acceptance, we need to limit adverse impacts of urban air mobility. This begins with transparency about these impacts, which include noise, visual pollution, emissions, battery life cycle challenges, impact on electricity capacity, and impact on existing modes of public transportation. Let's look at noise, which is one of these adverse impacts. There are many communities who currently experience negative impacts from aircraft noise, often because they're located near large airports. But think about how you feel when you see and hear a medical helicopter overhead. Our awareness and appreciation for the benefit that such an aircraft provides obviates our irritation at the noise it might make. While manufacturers are working on reducing the decibel level for eVTOL aircraft, doing only that oversimplifies the problem. Perceived annoyance of noise is also dependent on ambient noise levels, times and places of operation, and again, the counterbalancing value that urban air mobility brings. Non-acoustic factors such as these must be part of the public acceptance equation. And you can make a similar comparison with the other adverse impacts such as visual or effect on grid capacity. To enable the maximum benefit from UAM, it needs to be integrated with the existing transportation landscape within a community. A good integration approach isn't just about where you think you'll have the most on-demand air taxi riders. Vertiports need to be strategically located to integrate with transportation hubs such as light rail stations and airports. So for example, locating a vertiport on top of a building if the street below is a through bus route with no curbside capacity for drop-off and pickup of passengers is not going to work. UAM has to take accessibility and social equity considerations into account. UAM also needs to integrate in a constructive way with existing transit. So for example, we don't want to funnel more people into an already overtaxed subway system, but perhaps we can use UAM to increase ridership on an underutilized light rail system. And finally, UAM needs to integrate with and augment existing goods delivery modes as well. The third revolution in aviation will not occur overnight. The industry's taking a crawl, walk, run approach to technology and certification. Communities need to do the same. In the crawl phase, we'll see public engagement and demonstration projects. As we move to the walk phase, we'll repurpose existing infrastructure, such as GA airports, to allow commercial operations. And finally, in the run phase, we'll see new infrastructure, regulations, and operations. Until now, this new industry has been a technology push. These new vehicles are the result of those new technologies we considered in the first slide: electrification of propulsion, autonomy, networks. But there is no expressed market need, and there won't be if local stakeholders don't begin by learning about UAM and considering how it might benefit their communities. It's important for public acceptance that the crawl phase projects demonstrate a high level of public benefit as compared to adverse impacts. Use cases such as emergency services, first responders, medical deliveries, and essential goods deliveries make for excellent crawl phase demonstrations. I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. So while the COVID-19 pandemic has completely upset most of our lives, it may have some bright spots for the UAM industry. The demonstrated need for resilience and flexibility helps support the need for crawl phase projects such as emergency services and goods delivery. While we don't know what the longer term impact will be, we can surmise that introducing another low occupancy mode of travel into our metropolitan multimodal transportation systems will be useful. Additionally, the pandemic has forced many employers and employees alike to embrace remote work. This may lead to a transition, at least among those who are able to work remotely, from a daily single occupancy vehicle commute to a remote work week with 1 or 2 days of UAM travel into the office. Is the UAM industry prepared for a completely different kind of aviation? Advanced air mobility involves the intimate integration of the third dimension into our metropolitan transportation systems. Riding in one of these aircraft will be one option or mode in a multimodal transportation system that must function as a whole and must serve the community. Are cities and metropolitan regions prepared for this new form of transportation? UAM technology is moving forward rapidly, but transportation planning has a 10 to 20 year window. Are metropolitan planning organizations incorporating the third dimension into their plans? And what about airports? Are utilities aware of the electric grid capacity needs that this form of transportation will require? Are departments of commerce thinking about the effects on workforce development? While we're still years away from a fully built out urban air mobility system, we are also years out when it comes to planning for this system. So in comes the Community Air Mobility Initiative. CAMI was created to broaden the conversation and support local decision makers with UAM integration. We're a 501c3 nonprofit which educates and equips state and local decision makers, the public and the media with the information they need to set policies and design infrastructure and systems that address transportation needs for their communities. CAMI also brings the concerns of these communities back to the UAM industry to help the industry chart the right course for success. So while my co-executive director, Anna Dietrich, and I each have over a decade of experience in the electric aviation industry, CAMI is relatively new. We were founded about a year ago, and we are grateful to the forward-looking companies and organizations shown here that have provided early financial support, including Jump Aero. We're particularly proud that our supporters represent a broad spectrum of stakeholders: OEMs, large and small, first-tier suppliers, other organizations and associations, governments, departments of transportation, and airports. We're a virtual organization which operates globally. As I mentioned, Anna and I serve as the co-executive directors of CAMI. And we're fortunate to have a growing team of experts in areas such as infrastructure, operations, markets, environment, transportation, and public acceptance that contribute to the work that we do, including Peter Shannon, who's on our panel today. On our website, you'll find a growing set of resources, including the videos from our first UAM 101 virtual event, our library of CAMI notes, and our upcoming guidebook for cities. More resources are being added regularly, and we're working to build out our future event schedule. Though relatively young, CAMI has achieved a lot in the past year. In addition to that resource library and the half-day UAM workshop, we've provided multiple presentations at symposia, conferences, working groups, and meetings such as this one. We participate in a broad selection of industry groups, and we're now developing a new set of webinars, some targeted for specific audiences, and some which will be topical deep dives. Understanding transportation integration involves modeling and simulation. CAMI is working with NASA on their project to develop an open source software tool that planners and decision makers can use to model the addition of urban air mobility to their transportation system. And we're excited to partner with Ellison Associates on the Urban Air Policy Collaborative. So this 6-month program brings together a dozen forward-leaning jurisdictions to consider the policy issues and solutions for the integration of UAM into communities. The vision of the collaborative is to unify local governments on policy issues pertaining to the integration and operation of UAM technologies into existing transportation networks. And our goals are to provide a forum for those local governments to anticipate and integrate UAM into these networks in a manner that is safe, sustainable, equitable, and quiet, and to give a voice to local governments that can feed into efforts at the national and international level. Here you can see the jurisdictions that are participating in our collaborative, and some of the range of topics that we are considering, including policy, safety, equity, public engagement, land use regulations, adverse impacts, economic benefits, urban transportation system integration, privacy, and security. So as this program progresses, we look forward to sharing its findings with the broader stakeholder community and to expanding this conversation into an ongoing conversation with local jurisdictions and growing our number of participants. So we invite you to consider supporting our work by becoming a member of CAMI. Our membership program is not based on company revenue, but allows each member to select the level of benefits and support that work best. We're available to meet with industry members, state and local decision makers, airports, transportation departments, and other stakeholders to do presentations, develop and implement community engagement plans, or work with you to address the specifics of your community. So on behalf of CAMI, thank you for listening. Please visit our website and consider joining us as a member. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Yolanka. We did have a question come up on the Q&A about whether or not you would be able to share this presentation with the broader group.
Oh, sure. Sure.
Okay.
I mean, I think you're recording it, and we can also make it available as a PDF afterwards.
That would be wonderful. Yes, if you send it to me, then I can disseminate it to all the participants, if you don't mind.
Perfect.
And just a reminder for everybody who's on the who's listening in, we have quite a few people. Some of you are raising your hand for questions. Because of the format that we're doing this and the number of people who are participating, we're going to be taking questions on the Q&A button. So when you see at the very bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says Q&A. And so please click that button and type in your question, and then we'll try to answer it live. And so, okay, so that's great. Okay, so we have actually a question coming to you, Yolanka, about whether or not you work with startups in the drone delivery space.
It's a good question. So our focus is primarily on the larger vehicles, not on small UAS. However, we do recognize that just like we need to integrate with ground transportation systems, we also need to integrate with, or UAM needs to integrate with the small drone delivery space as well. So, we work tangentially in understanding that is part of the larger ecosystem. But CAMI's focus is specifically with state and local jurisdictions and on the implementation of the larger vehicles.
Perfect. And I think alongside that question, there's another question that just came in about community acceptance. Your definition of community, is that various stakeholders from private citizens to major corporations to government of every nation, or how do you put the borders on where communities stop?
It's a really good question, and it's why we chose the word community as opposed to city or state or province or whatever. It's intentionally vague, but it's meant to encompass the group of people that together are impacted socially, economically, and specifically with transportation systems. So I think that you see a lot of variation, and for example, this collaborative that we're doing shows some of that variation. And it's one of the reasons why the implementation in communities is very much not a one-size-fits-all. It needs to be tailored to the needs of those communities. So we may be talking about a small, a rural community that needs regular access into an urban center to get to medical facilities or to a hub airport or to connect with other smaller communities. We may be talking about a Los Angeles, which will be very different from a Seattle, where I live, or a Fargo, North Dakota. So I think the key here is to understand that transportation systems, transportation networks tend to develop around communities, whether they're small or large, and urban air mobility is folding into that existing transportation system and adding a third dimension to it.
Perfect. Okay, we're going to take one more question that is actually two questions going to be wrapped into one, and then we're going to move on to the panel. And so the question is, it's a follow-up to the question that was just asked about whether or not you have any kind of mechanisms to resolve conflicts within the community. And then the I guess second part of the question is, which community do you feel is the leader in terms of integration of UAM with intermodal transportation, so that other communities can follow it?
Sure. So in terms of the mechanism, I think it varies. And we are early on here. What part of the reason for founding CAMI was a recognition that in most communities, there is not even an awareness of what UAM is. And again, that's if you think back to that slide where I talked about the technology push versus the market pull. Over here in the aviation industry, we've been busy developing the technology for these vehicles, but it wasn't because communities were coming up to us saying, you know, if only we had an air vehicle to transport us to commute or for emergency services. It wasn't, the technology was not the result of a expressed market demand. So we developed the technology first. Now it's about starting off with helping those communities understand what is urban air mobility, what are the possible use cases it has, and then it's for that community to decide how urban air mobility may be useful to it. It's possible that urban air mobility won't be useful to some communities, but starting that conversation now is going to and being transparent is going to allow us to see where the push is, where the resistance is, And until we know that, it's hard to say how to resolve it. I think what we do know, what we've seen in some cases with small UAS, with the rollout of SUAS, with the rollout of some of the micromobility options like scooters and bikes, is that communities can have a lot of pushback if something like that is not done thoughtfully. And so that the whole idea is to get ahead of it. And Tim Torber, I know you asked me about, from Port of Seattle, you asked me about communities that are leading in this effort. I think certainly the jurisdictions that you saw on the map of the collaboration that we're doing are forward leaning into this. And worldwide, I think we see a lot of effort in the UK and in Scandinavia. And in fact, next week at the 3-day Electric Aircraft Symposium, we'll have a panel on regional efforts looking at Scandinavia and at Cascadia, that British Columbia, Washington, Oregon region, and looking at how those two areas are taking a regional approach to urban air mobility.
Perfect. Well, I think that that's a wonderful way to conclude and move on to the next phase of this webinar, which is really more meant to be a conversation with everybody who is also on the panel. So Yolanka, you did such a wonderful job kind of illustrating and setting the stage for some of the barriers that I think a lot of people aren't really considering, because this is often such a technology focused area that I think a lot of reporters and the general public really kind of focus on the technological aspect of it, and then they don't really think so much about some of the practical barriers, like whether or not we would be okay with an eVTOL flying over our personal heads every single day. So it's just really wonderful to hear your perspective and to know that there is an organization such as CAMI that exists to push this advocacy forward. I'm going to open it up to the rest of the panel to have the rest of the members discuss some of the other barriers and the importance of community acceptances as part of that list. So just as a brief introduction, aside from you, Yolanka, we also have Peter Shannon, as you mentioned, on the panel, who is the managing director and founder of Radius Capital, which is an early stage VC fund. So Peter, I'm sure, is a very familiar face to everybody who's on the phone or listening in. Peter, you've been involved in the eVTOL community and really just the aviation community generally for a number of years. And I think a lot of us have kind of look to you for any questions regarding the business of eVTOL and kind of some of the first really emerging business issues in terms of capital availability and the correct way for startups to grow. So it would be really great to hear your perspective. Kirsten, Bartok is also on the line. Kirsten, you're the managing director and founder of AirFinance. That's a boutique aviation investment in financing firm. You come from such a wealth of knowledge in not just the eVTOL and emerging tech space, but also in general aviation and some of the more traditional products. It would be really wonderful to hear your perspective on how the new technology will integrate with the more kind of older or traditional OEMs and maybe customers who are really used to traditional aviation options, and whether or not there's going to be a conflict there. So we'd love to hear your perspective. And Carl, you are an industry veteran. I'm sure that everybody who's on the line knows exactly who you are as an ex-founder of Terrafugia and currently as the president and founder of Jump Aero. Jump Aero, for those of you who are not familiar yet, is a eVTOL manufacturer focused on manned and unmanned solutions for the first responder community. So with that, we'd love to open it up to a broader conversation. Perhaps, Carl, we can start with you as somebody who has built and managed and really grown an eVTOL company before. What are some of the barriers that you see? And maybe you could give us a short list of the barriers as you see them for a typical eVTOL company as they enter this new phase.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I just want to reemphasize the importance of the work that CAMI is doing from my perspective. I think that that this is an area where we absolutely have to get ahead of the conversation as an industry. We have to engage. We have to go out there and do things that we as maybe technology-minded folks may not be as comfortable doing. You know, talking about practical societal issues and things of that nature. So I really appreciate Yolanka, the work that you and Anna and the team are doing at CAMI, and thank you for sharing your perspective on this. With regard to barriers, like coming from the OEM perspective, having kind of gone down this path before with Terrafugia and now with Jump Aero, there are a few things that, you know, are first and foremost in my mind as I think about challenges that we are going to have to overcome both as a company and in a broader context as an industry. Certainly certification of vehicles is a big one right now. There are no eVTOL aircraft that have been certified yet. That's one that there's a lot of work going on. I'm confident that there's a path forward. I'm happy to talk about that path. But as you pointed out, Yolanka, there's a lot of focus on that right now. And so I think that that conversation is fairly mature at this stage. Some other areas that are perhaps less mature is the airspace integration issues. You know, the FAA just released their UAM ConOps v1.0 over the past couple weeks. There's some interesting ideas that have been floated there. I think that's still at a really early stage, even though there's been a lot of conversation, particularly from the UTM construct, the unmanned world. The pilot population is another huge challenge that we're going to have to overcome that I think is not talked about very much. Most of these aircraft would generally be categorized by an outside party that's not familiar with the regulatory landscape as like something like a powered lift or a tilt rotor aircraft. Well, there is only a handful of powered lift pilots out there that have powered lift ratings. Most of them came out of the military. They flew Ospreys, V-22s, that sort of thing. There are actually only about 8,000 pilots that have both fixed and rotary wing licenses. That's a huge issue. That's not that's an inadequate supply of pilots, and there's generally an agreement that the first wave of these eVTOL vehicles will require a pilot on board. So that could be a big barrier if we're not able to find a path to bring traditional fixed wing pilots, for which there are hundreds of thousands of them, to be able to safely and legally operate eVTOL aircraft. At least as a placeholder until we get to more advanced stages of autonomy. So the pilot population is a significant challenge. The infrastructure issues, Yolanka, you already mentioned, the power grid issues, vertiport issues, noise impacts, et cetera. Technology standards, we want to be able to operate these aircraft simply and reliably. Implementing what's called simplified vehicle operations, new standards for detect and avoid technology. Again, a lot of technology kind of coming out of the unmanned world. V2V networking, datacomms that don't exist right now in general aviation. These are technologies that are going to be absolutely necessary to achieve the capacities of operations that we're talking about that will provide that eventual very attractive return on investment that all these companies are hoping to achieve. Those are big challenges beyond just the traditional batteries and fuel cells. And actually a lot of those technology challenges have more to do with standardization than the particular technology itself. I mean, datacom radios are not hard technology. It's how do you get everybody to agree on a standard and a protocol, and in what form do you have that conversation? So those are industry-wide challenges. Community acceptance, I think, is the big one, and this is the one where I am really pleased that CAMI is out there and really running point on this challenge. We need to get ahead of this. It is a big potential hazard for the industry that we could wind up in a situation where we get the type of pushback that we've seen in other urban mobility segments. So I think you've done a fantastic job of outlining those challenges. And then two areas that are less let's say less easy to mitigate. The fundamental weather sensitivity of eVTOL or any sort of aviation application is a significant challenge that, particularly for smaller aircraft that tend to have lighter wing loadings and disc loadings, things of that nature, that's going to be harder to mitigate than it is for instance, for commercial airliners. This is something that's not talked about that often. Are there strategies where we could, by integrating more carefully with urban transportation networks, have, as part of my flight in, if the weather is questionable for my flight back, could I, get a free pass on the light rail system to get me back out or something like that? Can things be integrated more effectively in that way so that I will be more likely to take the trip in the air when I can and not be worried about getting stuck somewhere due to weather changes and that sort of thing. And then finally, a point which Kirsten has mentioned many times is we have well over 200 startups and other companies out there in this space. There is insufficient capital out there to fund 200 ventures to develop full stack fly-by-wire control systems and certify them. That's a huge challenge for industry. It's going to be one that will naturally, I think, be sorted out by that limited resource environment, but it is nonetheless a significant barrier to the emergence of some interesting technologies. So with that, that's kind of my quick list of the major barriers that I'm tracking. But I'd like to kind of turn it over to the other members of the panel. Kirsten, maybe since I just mentioned that one that I know you've talked about before, I want to throw that one right to you, and then maybe Peter, you can chime in on that. So
we also have a new panelist just joined us, Graham Warwick. Thank you so much. I know that you mentioned that there was a storm that knocked you out, so we really appreciate you persevering and still being online. For those of you who are not familiar with Graham, he's the managing editor of technology at Aviation Week. And I know that Aviation Week also had a webinar this morning about a very similar topic. So we're very glad to have you here. We'd love to hear your insights. So thank you very much.
I'm sorry it's late. I do, as you can see probably from the darkness over there, there's a storm going on. So.
Gosh. Well, we're really glad to have you with us, and we really appreciate you. Thank you. Perfect.
So Kirsten, do you have any particular thoughts, your perspective on the largest barriers that we have to overcome here?
Sure. We can easily, we have a long list, but we'll start with the capital as you mentioned it. My concern, I think, and we've seen this in the past with startup aerospace companies, and when you saw this historically, whether it be Eclipse or Atom Aircraft, they weren't even, let's say, jumping the shark like we're seeing the third revolution that we talk about today. There wasn't the autonomy issue, there wasn't the distributed propulsion, there wasn't a completely new design of an aircraft to get over the hurdle. And even in those cases, there wasn't enough capital in the ecosystem to support them. I don't think that exists today. I do believe there is enough capital in the markets, but we do need to see some metrics and some performance to encourage that. And I don't believe that there will be enough capital to support, let's say, I always like to use the hand of maybe 5 independent VTOL companies, but I would think it'd be hard with the capital requirement. Now, let me talk a little bit further for many of you out there, and Carl, you and I have discussed this at length. If you just look historically what an aircraft costs to get to certification, that has typically been in the, let's say, $800 to $1 billion. And we're not always talking about, let's say, a highly advanced, Gulfstream 700 or 650. We could also be talking about a single engine turboprop, the Denali that Textron's doing. So I am concerned that there is some underestimating going on in our VTOL world of how much it's going to cost. I do appreciate, and Carl, you've educated me a great deal, how a thin client approach can be taken, if you want to use that terminology, and needs to be taken if we're going to create vehicles that are lighter and more simple to operate. And hopefully with that approach and rethinking the industry, we may be able to get the cost down. I want to add one additional thing which always concerns me is that What we see in the industry is that most of the VTOL companies want to operate the aircraft themselves. They want to do the maintenance, they want to do the operations, they want to kind of control the vertiports, handle the customer interface. That is a full stack, solution in some extent, but it is also trying to potentially do too much. One, will those companies have the expertise without partnering with the discrete, professionals who've done those type of things in the past in the general aviation industry? And two, just the concept of biting off all of those different tasks and operations in addition to the manufacturing is concerning. It is very capital intensive. I could go on, but I feel like there's many others. So let's go back and talk about infrastructure for a few minutes. I think that we're going to have to accept a world in which, when these aircraft get certified, that we are not going to have the infrastructure that we want in place today. I like that NASA is focused on the concept of operations, but we're going to have to understand that the vertiports aren't going to be in place, the communication systems, the back and forth technology of alerting on the weather. And so early on, as we gain customer acceptance, and Yolanka thinks about this every day, is I think we're going to have to, that the density is going to be slower, and we're going to build up that infrastructure, those enabling technologies that will allow the density and the operations to become much more frequent.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
And if I could just jump in on one
Please.
quick point to follow on that, Kirsten, we also need to remember that when it comes to the actual infrastructure, whether it's the vertiports or the charging stations, et cetera, you're also now working with local regulations. You're following, and aviation is not so used, it's primarily preempted by federal law, but when it comes to land use and zoning, now you're intersecting with local law, and you're intersecting with a different set of laws everywhere. So it's certainly not a question to leave to the last minute.
And I'm going to follow up with you for one point. You're talking about a federated country of 50 states, and every airport makes its own operations, and that's already complicated with under the FAA. I'm also worried, spent a bit of time with EHang lately and talking to the Europeans. I think we're going to have a highly divided and almost siloed world, that China may come out, have a completely unique set of requirements and operations. EHang will not be able to operate outside of that jurisdiction, and that the Europeans and the Americans will take such a different approach on the approval that you may have very siloed operations, aircraft, as well as ecosystems around it.
Which is going to have a significant impact on how profitable a company can be and how limited it is on scaling.
Mm-hmm. We sound like Debbie Downers, and we're really not, right? We're believers. It's just, there's a lot to do. And I'll go back, and I remember I was around when we took Netscape public at Goldman, and it kind of had been in Silicon Valley for a long time. And if you look at how much has been built, Cosmo.com was created, and it was, grocery delivery in 2000, and it went bankrupt because it was too early. But now today, we all know we can get grocery delivery. It did take 20 years, 25 years to come around, but we have to recognize that this is all a process. It will happen. And part of how we're all going to be successful is where to invest in that process, what part is needed right now, and be careful not to get ahead of ourselves.
And it's such a great point that you make, because the difference between Cosmo in 2000 and then grocery delivery's success today, you can really characterize it in iterations. It's iterations in underlying technology. It's the emergence of the smartphone platform, but it's also iterations in consumer habits and behaviors, and people thinking, oh yes, of course I could, consider ordering this food online or getting these groceries delivered. And, it's important that we go through this same type of enumeration of all of the barriers and all of the challenges that we face between where we stand today with this technology and the full set of different visions that we have for how we're going to use it in the future. And yeah, it's daunting when you list them all out. we did that on the National Academy's report that I was on the committee of that published in February. One of the statements of task for that was to describe the vision and then lay out all the barriers between here and getting to the vision. And I think actually in that report we used the word daunting when we laid it out. But again, so the way I look at it, so much of this is going to be about iterations. I spend a lot of my time thinking about how does this industry look in a electric powered flight, but still with human pilots in the cockpit in some fundamental capacity. And these types of aircraft operating in an airspace system that looks quite a lot like the airspace system that we have today. Because if we look back through the history of aviation, we have seen leaps forward in either the air vehicles or in the airspace system capability, but they tend to play off one and the other in sequence. Whereas what we talk about here today is really about making big changes in both of them simultaneously, which I just don't think it's going to play out that way. I think that we're going to see these vehicles emerge. They're going to get certified. They're going to go into low rate production and they will grow from there. But they will have pilots in the beginning. But I do believe that they will serve a multiplicity of different missions beyond the urban air taxi or the UAS doing cargo delivery, that there actually is latent demand in so many different areas. And I tuned into Graham's panel this morning and they covered that. One of the things that was brought up was the demand from the tourism industry and how that might surface as an early market. So I think a lot about how can this industry thrive and grow in those earlier chapters of electric powered flight where we still have pilots at the controls. And I think that through that period of time, this industry is going to attract a whole lot of talent. We're going to gain a huge amount of experience in the technology, in the manufacturing, in the maintenance and the operations. And we are going to have a ton of additional capital at our disposal. We won't be funding this on pure investor capital with very thin revenues and no profits, and then trying to go and do this entire vision. We'll be in a different place. We'll have much bigger, much more capable companies that can execute for those future steps to getting us towards complex urban air taxi operations and getting us towards much higher density of the use space. And so it's going to be stepwise. But when we think about the barriers to getting to that first place, let's think about societal acceptance. What are the aspects of societal acceptance that we need to go and get to that first level of deployment of these aircraft, where yes, they might be operating as air ambulances, they might be operating at low density, similar to helicopter type density over cities, but they also might be operating in all kinds of other operating environments, be it in rural areas, be it in an industrial setting, or within the defense sphere. And looking at it that way, we go through the set of barriers that exist, from how do we condition the public, how do we get them comfortable with the safety of these aircraft, how do we just establish a level of familiarity so that they are making the right type of associations when they first encounter these aircraft. And when we start to break that down, that might help us figure out how do we go from this big set of barriers that we face down to real clarity on what we go and focus on for these next few years, and how we choose those activities in a way that we know builds us assets and builds us additional capability to go and tackle the rest afterwards.
I think that those are all fantastic points. To follow up on that, we actually have a really great question from the audience, from Tim. Is there any work that existing Part 135 on-demand charter operators that are existing now can do to alleviate barriers for the industry, which eVTOL may encounter later on down the road once certification is achieved? So maybe we can talk a little bit as a group about the current state of the industry now, and what can the existing players do to help with the oncoming.
If I could jump in here, I think that it's actually a really important time now to ask that question, because The industry itself, the 135 industry, is kind of waiting to see how it's going to come out of COVID. I mean, there's this talk about the fact that people's health concerns would mean that they would favor private aviation, and there were some signs in sort of the May timeframe that might happen. There were a lot of inquiries about private aviation, charter, and other things like that. So if out of this COVID you have a wider acceptance of private aviation, of flying from small airports in small airplanes, then that kind of preconditions at least one of the potential markets for these vehicles. So we're kind of in that waiting to see phase. It'll be done with the airplanes that we have available today. It'll be done with the TBMs. It'll be done with the PC-12s. It'll be done with maybe even SR-22s. If I don't know, but that will give us an indication as to whether people are willing to embrace aviation as a mode of transportation when they would, either as an alternative to because they can't get, or they don't want to go on a normal aviation, or as an alternative to some other mode of transport. Because the key to this market is getting people out of other modes of transportation. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch how people react in this phase we're in now. And the Part 135 operators, their terminals, their airplanes, their how easily they are to access are going to be really important.
I think, thank you, Graham. I agree with you. And I think an additional point to think about here, we've had conversations with some of the smaller GA and regional airports themselves who are asking, how do we get involved? And I think parallel to existing Part 135 operators, picking up some of this operation is the focus on GA airports, not just how they can move towards supporting electric aviation, but really kind of a change in the way we perceive GA airports, having them be a greater part of the community in which they exist. So yes, having solar panels, but having that charging and storage ability be something that helps the whole community. So during low charging times for aircraft, they could be feeding back into a community grid. They could, in effect, become a microgrid for their community. They can be a transportation hub and a charging center for ground transportation as well, and a distribution center for goods delivery. So I think there's some creative thinking that can be done around how we use these assets, the existing airports that have been, for the most part, abandoned or mostly abandoned. But again, getting out of our aviation silo and thinking more broadly about those resources.
I would bring you back to cost, though. I mean, if we can't do this, these people who've come into the general aviation space because of COVID-19 are people who can afford even the high cost of a King Air C90 taking them. So if you look at that, if the VTOL revolution doesn't greatly change the cost equation, then I don't think this will ever proliferate. So that means to me that we need, and I use this word, thin client aircraft, who are not using the very heavy, complicated, expensive systems from our traditional tier 2 suppliers, and they need to recreate this on their own. Because, and without the reasonably cost aircraft, any customer acceptance, any environmental acceptance isn't going to matter, unfortunately.
I mean, listening to what all you guys have been talking about when I finally managed to get on, when I started following this market, I mean, it's like you think it's technology driven, right? I mean, from what Peter, what you were saying, it's like we're trying to invent the iPhone and the internet at the same time, and Apple could never have done that. They did the iPhone, but they had the internet to work with. We're trying to, in essence, at the end state, we're trying to do both at the same time. So we've got to kind of break it down into chunks that we can actually do. Absolutely. So I've always thought it's been a technical problem, but the longer I go, the less I see it being a technical problem, the more I see it being a community acceptance customer adoption problem. How do you not have people oppose these aircraft because they think only rich people are flying them? How do you deal with the really, really tricky problem of perceived noise? And how do you really just, you know, do people actually want to fly anywhere when they can get in their own car, switch on the driverless thingy, start reading the newspaper, you know? So it is that, and I'm increasingly, I'm strongly coming to the belief that we need something like the drone IPP, you know, which it really, the thing that's broken the drone delivery market is the IPP. The IPP gave a so the IPP did what CAMI's trying to do, is it brought, we were all siloed before the IPP. The drone people weren't talking to the local authorities, weren't talking to the potential operators, weren't talking to the people that were, the people who were trying to get goods to wherever. The IPP in each of their use cases did that bringing together. And it has a route to commercial market at the end of it. Out of the IPP, we are seeing commercial operations. Part 130, new Part 135 operators, UPS, Flight Forward, Alphabet Wing. We need something like that. We need to be able to find those use cases that make economic sense, that gain societal traction, which medical delivery absolutely has done for the drones. And then we need to have a program that's structured to bring the local authorities, the communities and the regulators and the operators together. I don't know how we do that, but I think that's, until we do something like that, we're kind of just hoping that people are gonna, when we open shop, we're kind of hoping people are gonna walk in the front door. I think we have to do more than that. We have to get out of the front door of our shop and show people through test cases that what these can do, and at the same time generate the data that goes to the FAA that allows them to write the regulations that make it become routine and regular and not a special case.
Yeah, and I think a lot about that, and about how can NASA's National Campaign Program, which today is in its early stages, helping us work towards a certifiable air vehicle and helping us understand the performance capabilities of these VTOL aircraft. You know, what is their turning radius while maintaining passenger comfort? What type of landing profiles are they going to need to use, et cetera. But how can the national campaign in its later stages address the things that you're speaking about? And one of the things that you hit upon is that what we're doing in this space in terms of flight testing, it's not just about developmental flight testing to determine the performance envelope of the aircraft, but it's really about operational flight testing to explore how we use an aircraft that we already know how it flies, but how do we use it in a given new type of mission? And what new types of applications can we actually craft out of these aircraft? And to do that, we need to have really robust flight test environments available to us, both in simulation as well as true physical facilities with airspace and with all the resources and telemetry on the ground, such that companies that want to go and develop this can do it on an ongoing routine basis. This is a 365-day-a-year test, flight test and development capability. Think of it as a rapid development environment for these technologies. So, something that you can use on an ongoing basis, where it's not, you have to start planning 6 or 7 months ahead of time to have a 3-week period of time at somebody's test range and go through all of the red tape and all of the overhead to get there. That just doesn't, we're not going to go fast enough if that's the way we have to do it. We need this type of capability in the United States at several locations, and it's just something that you can plug into and you can start developing.
And it has to have a commercial path. I mean, the thing about the IPP is if you go and do the weight med flights or something like that, it's a test bed, but it becomes a commercial service in place. So if we're going to go create these test beds, and there are some, like you look at Alliance Airport, you could do drone deliveries, you could do taxis around, such a huge, and there's also a huge industrial state somewhere in the US that is massive, where you could actually do commercial air taxis within the confines of the industrial area, we need to, and the thing is that you have something at the end of the test period, at the end, when you hand your data to the FAA, you have an ongoing commercial concern where that was built up. And I think the national campaign is great because it generates data, but it's a cyclical thing. You know, you build up to it, you do it for a period of time, and then there's nothing that persists after it. It needs, either it needs in its later stages to have that, it needs to build in that commercial persistence that comes out of that. And maybe that's what you do.
It sounds like you're advocating for something that's sort of a broad-based national or perhaps international testing and demonstration capability that would effectively lead to the equivalent of a type certificate, like we have.
I think it's more important than just a type certificate. I mean, you know, you need the certificate. I think it's the operation. It's showing that the operation works. And I think the use case can be really narrow. I mean, given your situation at Jump Aero, it could be an IPP type program that just demonstrates you can get a first responder to the downtown in a few minutes, and you just set it up to demonstrate that use case. Leaves a residual commercial capability, shows the society what can be done, and it could be any one of things. It could be EMS in some places. It could be whatever, you know, organ delivery. I know we are heading towards that, but I mean, it could be any number of very, very sort of narrow use cases that you can build a business case around and find a test location that will leave in place a commercial capability.
Yeah. Yeah, and building the acceptance of that path, I think, is absolutely critical. And the ability to demonstrate, collect the data, show whoever needs to be shown that this can be done safely, that that the impact on the communities that it serves is quantifiable and acceptable. And you know, not that there will be no impact; there always will be, but that these technologies and these particular niche, you know, target entry points like Jump Aero is talking about for a first responder, just to get to the scene of the emergency faster than anything else. That's all we're trying to do, and that's really, we are trying to be very, very specific with that, because I agree with what you're saying here, that you can't boil the ocean. You really want to be very, very targeted and focus on that one thing. And if we had the kind of capabilities, Peter, that you and Grant are talking about, where we could just go to one of these test ranges and say, look, and they say, after you've demonstrated these capabilities, all right, you're good to go to start providing your service. And you know, it would be an interesting discussion to have with the FAA. And I know that I was speaking before to Wes Ryan, who I don't know if he's on the line or not, but you know, about the opportunities to engage more with the FAA early on and get them more in the loop, not just on the certification side of things, but on the operations side of things, the Part 135 side of things. And we're not trying to be a 135 operator by any stretch, but I think that for the air taxi model in particular, you've got to get that experience. We have to start doing it soon to have a viable path forward.
Can I just jump in with an example of one thing that's just happened of a regulatory approach that actually is with help in Europe. In Europe, the sort of the airworthiness part of the aircraft is soft law, and the operating part of the aircraft is hard law. And it's so the EASA can change things. So that's why they're moving so quickly on VTOL, because they can do that in soft law. But then when you write their operating rules for that aircraft, it's hard law, and it takes a long time to get that. They've just certified the Pipistrel Velis Electro, which is a two-seat training aircraft, and they wrote the operating rules as part of the certification, which allowed, so they wrote the type certificate, gave it the type certificate. They also wrote what they call the exemption to the operating rules, which allows any buyer, any national authority to to make an exception to the operating rules so that you can immediately you take the delivery of that aircraft, you can put it into flight training service. You don't have to go through a long process like we've seen here in the US, where people have bought electric trainers and then can't get approval to train people in them. They took an integrated approach, knowing it was a new technology. They said, we've got to approve the technology and give them a chance to operate it in one thing. And that's kind of what we need the FAA to do. We need the FAA to say, for these use cases, we'll give you the type certificate and this operating envelope that goes with it, you know, and then you can go off and do that. But you can't go outside that, but you can go off and do that.
But Graham, let's raise 2 points. One, those organizations within the FAA are very separate. And we all know that unfortunately the FSDOs don't talk to the folks in DC. And so I have little hope of any conversation going back between those two groups. And because they clearly, the feedback we've received is it's not happening now. I hope it does happen. I think heading to that, the feedback I've received from the European operators and VTOL manufacturers is that they are so much happier with the flexible approach, the non-prescriptive approach that EASA is taking. They have, exactly as you point out, as they've been with Pipistrel, they've been working on it together. It's a collaborative approach. They're being flexible, and they think that's going to be an enormous advantage. And it's funny, the US, manufacturers, developers, and big to think the FAA is going to be an advantage, but I'm kind of with you. It sounds to me like we have I don't want to say dysfunctional organization here, and there are good people there. They are trying hard to make this not very functional, but they just have a lot of historical barriers, and then the MAX has just hindered them even more.
Yeah. Let me jump in on that, because I can say, having been involved, early on and had team members involved in the Part 23 Amendment 64 rewrite as part of the ARC for that. And then, the new Amendment 64 has extracted the prescriptive language from the language that would be the certification basis for these aircraft, moved it over into industry standards. So that there is that flexibility on the cert side. And I would say we're getting great engagement on the cert side of the house. We do not have the engagement that we're going to need to be successful on the flight standards side of the house. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges. And I'll wear my my GAMA hat as the chairman of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association's Committee on Simplified Vehicle Operations. We've been trying for a number of years to get increased engagement from flight standards. It's extremely difficult. They've been, as you said, hindered by the 737 MAX and the challenges on that side of the house. But it's very, very difficult. And this is going to be it will become a major challenge as time goes on if we can't really break down the barriers inside the FAA itself between the cert guys, the flight standards guys, and eventually the ATO folks, the airspace, controllers. It really will involve that full community. And the FAA, I should say, to their credit, they have at the highest levels recognized this problem and tried to make some structural changes to, in recognition of it. But the boots on the ground, it hasn't propagated its way all the way through the organization. And so we're still, butting our heads up against this issue where we don't know what the path forward is going to be or what type of timeline there will be to get a pilot's license to operate an SVO type eVTOL aircraft, right? All of these eVTOL aircraft they don't have 8 throttle levers for the 8 rotors. They're operated in a very different way. They have a significant degree of automation in their fly-by-wire or indirect flight control system. And that's implicit in the technology and the design of the aircraft. That the licensing piece of it on the pilot side is not there yet. The recognition of what it will take, the clarity on that path forward is not there yet. So Graham, I'm curious, on EASA's side, on the ops side of the house, are you seeing more progress in that area?
Well, the way they put it when they did the pipistrel thing is that they're actually using it as it's still a it's a special case, but the EASA regards it as being a way to get feedback from that approach while they go through the hard law regulation. So it's and then the FAA has actually used this term, which is operate then regulate, which is which I think is the greatest thing that could happen, is get data, then regulate. And so in the case of the EASA and pipistrel, that is the approach they took. They said, we're going to give you, there's no point in us, letting you put an airplane out there that then nobody can use for its intended purpose for 5 years while we rewrite the regulations. So they took this, but they do say that explicitly that is to get them the experience they need to rewrite the regulations in the long term. So the exemption process in the short term is you regulate in the long term. One of the big concerns there's always been about the European approach is it sets up VTOLs as a special category. And of course, the special category applies a special operating rules. And a lot of the manufacturers are not, particularly the US manufacturers, and I know Gamma's talked about this, the US manufacturers, Greg Bowles and everything, before he was there, were not happy with them being, eVTOLs being regarded as a special category because then they get treated differently. And you then bring all the time it takes to write, sorry, I broke my arm. You then get all of the thing that goes with having to write the rules for a special category. The kind of way that they wanted to do it in the US was do it under Part 23 with some tweaks, because then you don't have to go out and write a whole new set of Part 135, an equivalent of Part 135 or Part 191 for VTOLs. You want to try and avoid that. Europe has set itself up for having to create special rules for VTOLs, but they also appear to be accompanying it with a flexibility in getting to that end point and allowing things to happen in the meantime while they do that operating rules in the long term.
And I would add, from a community acceptance perspective, what that also allows for is developing that market demand that we, in essence, don't yet have. It's helping to find homes for the technology that are, that provide a strong public benefit, that have limited adverse impacts, and that can make sense for a community to start to visualize how they would use that. And I think that was one of the great benefits of the IPP program.
Yeah, I think actually Europe did. I don't know where this is. I mean, a few years back they did propose a whole new approach to certification and operation of CS-23 class aircraft, which brought in a market development phase into the, so you would go through the conforming prototype and initial production, and then they would give you an approval to build a batch, X 50, 100, 150 airplanes that would allow you to get them out into selected markets, and then you would go through a market development phase during which the regulator was involved, and the regulator was getting feedback and data, and then you would get like the final approval, go forward. And I kind of think that appeals to me, because that's the thing the manufacturers want. They kind of maybe do want to get those first 50 aircraft out and into operation to learn what needs to be done before they actually finally, sign off, cast in stone. That's the airplane. And but I don't know where that proposal is, but it did seem very sensible to me.
And you do see that happening a bit in China right now. I mean, I think where EHang is going to have an advantage over everyone, they're kind of allowed to operate in the black market to do this here or there. And, looks like maybe even more in the open market in another year. So I agree with you, Graham.
Yeah.
So, Gary Geisen at WISC, who of course is doing a two-seat autonomous self-flying. He was at the Vertical Flight Society, did a webinar, and he was asked on that, how does he view his competitors? And so he talked about EHang, and his concern with EHang is that they are moving so fast, and they are moving with light regulation. This JARA-SORA approach rather than and we are a connected industry, and if EHang moves too fast, and if something goes wrong, we'll all suffer. Even if it happens in China, it will all suffer.
I'll slightly argue with you on that, Graham. Having spent a lot of time in China, I think one, we won't hear about accidents. It'll be cycle. That's the first thing, and there will be, without a doubt, for all the reasons you point out. And two, if you go back, and Kat knows this, she spent a lot of time in China with me, is that the Chinese expect the equipment they make to be not as high quality as the equipment from other nations. So the interesting part will have that'll end up, but they also recognize that some of the things they build early on may not be as high quality and safe as the other manufacturers. So I don't think it'll have as big of a black eye as you think.
To give the FAA a voice on the Q&A, Wes is saying that his focus is on getting from technology demonstrated to readiness for civil use in the way that companies can build up to. Most companies that they're talking to are not willing to do a low risk operation first and then work towards a higher risk operation. So it may be a case of startups having to work with the regulator.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the big challenges that the startups have, right? Is because, you know, in order to raise capital, right? Yeah, the startup is under a huge tension to be like, okay, we're going to be kings of the world in 3 years. Oh yeah, that's great. And the reality is, in this industry, no, you're not. And this is not a software scenario where you have like infinite scalability in no time at all. This is a complex manufactured product with a real supply chain and real operations where people's lives are on the line, and people are not attuned to move that quickly, right? And nor would I argue should they. That said, there's huge opportunity down the road. It's going to take some time to get there. And I think that one of the challenges that the startups in this space have right now is they feel like they have to sell into the hype cycle, which just builds the hype cycle up more and sets us up as an industry more to have deflated expectations when reality takes a whole lot longer to materialize. And so what I would personally love to see is more startups targeting very specific opportunities that may not be that kind of like home run that Silicon Valley wants to always wants to invest in, but is much more real, much more near term. That's my personal bias, but obviously I'm doing this myself. So I worry, after having tried to start Terrafugia in the wake of Eclipse and you know the VLJ scenario, that you know for future entrepreneurs 10, 15 years from now, if we overhype this and then have it crash, they're going to have a hell of a time getting their next generation of products or technologies off the ground.
Totally
so agree. Yeah. So I think we need to be a little bit, you know, perhaps a little bit more modest. That's not to say that there's not potential for great returns on investment, but a little bit more realistic, you know, to Peter, your point before, like doing an incremental step should not be seen as a negative. Doing it needs to be seen as more of a, yeah, this is a wise way of going about it.
And then that thing is flying. It's in the air.
Yeah.
It's showing the world that this is real. It's showing the market what this can be. And we know with these, you know, with these aircraft businesses, even if you sell a few hundred or 1,000 units a year, that still can be a business. Sure. And if you're opening up a new dimension of capability for the pilot population, or you're attracting a whole new generation of people into becoming a pilot because of that aircraft, yeah, it's a modest aircraft. It may be electrically propelled. It may not even be vertical flight capable. It may be, you know, short takeoff and landing aircraft, or just an electric trainer. But that opens that door. It makes it real. It shows the world what this can be. It gives us a chance to all operate and learn and really get to understand, okay, you know, what are the environmental impacts? What does an electric aircraft sound like, or what can it sound like? And how can we begin to use these in solving problems in, you know, different industries across the economy, or just for the general pilot population, and learn from them how they want to use it. Then you have a company that has experience, it has a big team, it has a lot of capabilities, it can manufacture, it knows how to design, it has a relationship with the FAA, it has access to capital. All of these things, let's do that a few times across this industry. And now we have some players that can go and tackle these much, much larger, more ambitious projects. And along the way, they've had growth and they've had profit and their shareholders have done really well. Yeah. Sounds great to me.
So it looks like we're coming up to the top of the hour here, and we have about 5 minutes left. We do have one unanswered question from the Q&A regarding traditional airspace tier 1 companies and how they can work with eVTOL emerging technology, given that they have experienced solutions in deeper pockets, but they're also much slower to act and have a lot of bureaucracy. So maybe we can end on a positive note about how there could potentially be collaboration between early stage startups and existing large players. Maybe we can touch on that.
Sure, well, I'll jump. Go ahead. Go ahead, Graham.
Honeywell is a classic example. I mean, I actually was at an AVSI conference I moderated a panel, a VFS panel at an AVSI conference about 3 years ago, and somebody from Honeywell stood up and said, we'd love to play in this market, but the price point you're asking for is ridiculous. Right? Fast forward 3 years, they've started a UAM division. Now, what they've realized is that a lot of these technologies are number one, they're scalable, and they're also applicable over a wide range of platforms. So if you look at what Honeywell is playing with in the UAM thing, it's sensors for collision avoidance, it's flight control computers, it's other things like navigation systems, etc. Now, they can put this into the existing GA market like that. The same things can go into the existing GA market, they can offer them into the new eVTOL market, and they are also the founding blocks for their next cockpit in the Gulfstream G900 or something like that. So the company has to have, the tier 1 has to have that holistic view that the technology, the key technologies are applicable across all their markets at different scales. So you look at with Honeywell's 1BA Systems is doing the same approach. They're sort of saying, okay, power management, that sort of thing is where we could probably play that across multiple different scaled markets. They will still struggle with the price point because they have overheads that the small guys don't have. But if we're going to get to 10 to the -9 for safety, they're the only companies that will get there. There might be one or two of the startups that will get there eventually. The Dedalians or the Skyrises or the whoever, they may get into that. They may become the new entrants. But we're going to rely for the next several years to get to 10 to the 9 on the tier 1s. They've got to rethink their product strategies so that they can get into that price point by architecting how they do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the big challenges that those tier 1s will have, and I think that one of the other big challenges that they have is there's so much static out there, and this is a challenge that any investor has in this space. There's so many new ventures coming out that just staying on top of who's doing what, how credible is the product, the team, the market, all that sort of thing. It's a significant challenge for any of the tier 1s that are out there right now. But I think, to your point, I think BAE Systems, Honeywell, they are starting down this path, and I think it's really got I think but I also think that there is an opportunity there for some startups to come out and actually compete, because having looked at some of the offerings out there from the tier 1s, they do tend to focus on the ones where we're seeing a lot of hype and a lot of investment, and that may not be the best place for them to be placing their bets, in my view. So that's something where I feel like we've got to.
Yeah, one dynamic with Honeywell, and also to a certain extent with Collins Aerospace, which is now obviously much broader than it was when it was just Collins, is they both. It's a bit like Ariane and SpaceX. Ariane completely ignored SpaceX and then had its market taken away. And then so the boss of it, the CEO of Airbus said, never again will we be taken by surprise by a startup. So they started a whole bunch of things to try and be more disruptive themselves. Both Honeywell and Collins let Garmin get established. Garmin started very much where we are talking about now, down in the experimental aircraft in that case, and they grew into this, you know, now they're still incredibly innovative, integrated avionics supplier who's just certified the first autonomy application in an airplane. So they are both desperate not to have that happen to them again. So that's one of the spurs to what's going on here. But there'll be a Garmin come out of all of this, or 2 Garmins or 3 Garmins will come out. It's inevitable because of the nature of the technology, that somebody's going to get their hands around this more quickly and more completely. I think, especially when we start to bring AI into it, I think you know, machine learning is really going to flip on its head who's a leader and who's not a leader, because I think it's going to make so many. It's going to disrupt so many different ways we do things. You know?
That's interesting. There could be a whole nother panel on that topic.
Well, this has been an amazing discussion. I mean, I've been getting messages throughout the last hour and a half, and it's hard to believe that it's been an hour and a half, about, you know, thank you notes and just compliments to everybody on the panel. So to everybody who's still watching, it looks like there's still quite a few people on. We are going to be sending a recording of this. We are going to be sharing the slides that Yolanka presented, her portion of the presentation. And if anybody has any questions, you all have my contact info, since I have sent each of you the invitation. So please reach out to me. I will be more than happy to put you in touch with anybody on the panel. Thank you for everybody who has participated, who has listened in, as well as everybody who is on our panel today. I really appreciate everybody's time. And if there's any closing remarks that you would like to make, now is the time, because we're going to be wrapping up.
I just want to say thank you for letting me join late.
No problem. We're so
great.
glad to have you.
Yeah.
Thanks for organizing a great
together.
panel.
Of course.
I'll put in a plug. If you're an OEM out there and you're not yet a member of CAMI,
Thank you, Carl.
talk to Yolanka.
I appreciate it.
All right.
You should be a member.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do this work.
That's right. That's right. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, everyone, for dialing in.
All right.
All right.
All right, guys.
Bye-bye.
We'll talk later.